Security, remove her. The words landed like a gavel in a courtroom, sharp, final, echoing across the private dining hall perched 40 floors above Manhattan, where crystal chandeliers glowed like frozen fire, and a single dinner deal carried the weight of $800 million, where every seat at the table belonged to someone who moved markets with a phone call, and every silence meant more than words. And yet in that moment, all of it collapsed into one thing. A young black waitress standing still beside a polished walnut table, her tray steady, her expression unreadable, as two security guards hesitated just long enough to notice something didn't feel right. While William Carter, billionaire CEO of Carter Global, leaned back in his chair with the casual confidence of a man who had never once been told no, adjusting his cufflinks as if dismissing people was just another line item in his schedule. His voice calm, but edged with something colder, something practiced. "I don't repeat myself," he said, eyes barely meeting hers. "You're done here." And around him the room shifted, not loudly but subtly, investors exchanging glances, a woman lowering her glass mid-sip, a man reaching for his phone beneath the table, because everyone understood this wasn't just about a waitress. This was a performance of power, a reminder of who controlled the room, who decided who stayed and who disappeared. And Naomi Brooks, in her pressed black uniform and quiet posture, should have been the easiest part of that equation. Invisible, replaceable, forgettable, except she didn't move, not an inch. Not even when the air tightened and the guards took a cautious step closer, because her eyes, calm and steady, were not the eyes of someone surprised or afraid or even offended. They were the eyes of someone who had already seen this moment coming. And that was the first crack, small but undeniable, in the illusion William Carter had built around himself, because power only works when it's unquestioned. And in that stillness, in that refusal to react, something shifted, subtle as a breath, sharp as a blade. And for the first time that night, the room wasn't watching the CEO, it was watching her, waiting, because something about Naomi Brooks said this wasn't over, not even close, and the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was loaded, like a question no one had the courage to ask out loud. What if the person he just erased was never his to erase in the first place? 1 second passed, then 2, and still Naomi Brooks did not move. And in a room where hesitation usually meant weakness, her stillness felt like something else entirely, something deliberate, something controlled, and the investors felt it before they understood it. A quiet shift in gravity that pulled their attention away from William Carter and toward the woman he had just dismissed, because power is loud until it meets something that does not need to be. And Naomi's silence was not empty. It was precise, measured, almost surgical, while William let out a short breath through his nose, the kind of restrained impatience that came from a man and used to resistance. "Do not make this more difficult than it needs to be," he said, his tone lower now, sharper, as if lowering his voice made it more final, more absolute. But Naomi simply tilted her head slightly, her gaze steady, not confrontational, not submissive, just present, as if she was looking at him the way one studies a problem that has already been solved. And that was when the first investor shifted in his seat, a subtle movement, but enough to break the rhythm of control William had built, because control depends on an audience that believes in it, and belief was starting to fracture, quietly, invisibly, like hairline cracks spreading beneath polished marble. And then Naomi spoke, not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to carry across the table. "Before I leave," she said, her voice calm, even, unmistakably composed, "you should know what you are actually doing." And the wording was careful, not emotional, not defensive, but precise, as if each word had been placed exactly where it needed to be. And that choice, that control, made several heads turn, because waitresses do not speak like that, not in rooms like this, not to men like him. And yet she did, without raising her voice, without asking permission, and William's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the smallest sign of irritation slipping through the armor of his confidence, because something about this was not following the script he was used to, the apology that never came, the compliance that never arrived, the quick exit that should have ended the moment, and instead the moment stretched, expanded, became something else entirely, something unpredictable, and unpredictability was the one thing William Carter did not tolerate. You are not in a position to advise me. He replied, each word clipped, controlled, but now carrying an edge that had not been there before, and Naomi nodded once, as if acknowledging the statement, not agreeing with it, just placing it where it belonged, and then she reached down, not quickly, not nervously, but with the same steady precision that had defined her every movement that night, and from beneath the table she lifted a slim, dark folder, one that had not been there before, or at least not noticed, and that alone was enough to pull the room tighter, because nothing appears out of nowhere in rooms like this without meaning something. And as she placed it gently on the polished surface, the soft sound of leather meeting would echoed louder than it should have, as if the room itself understood what was about to unfold. And for the first time since the night began, William Carter did not speak immediately, because something in the air had changed, and even he could feel it, that quiet, undeniable shift when power begins to move away from the person who thought they owned it, and toward the one who never needed to claim it in the first place. The folder did not look expensive. It was simple, matte black, no logo, no gold trim. And yet the way Naomi Brooks placed it on the table made it feel heavier than anything else in the room, heavier than the contracts, heavier than the numbers, heavier than the authority William Carter thought he controlled. And for a brief moment no one moved, not the investors, not the guards, not even the servers along the wall, because something instinctive told them this was no longer a scene they understood, and Naomi's fingers rested lightly on the cover before she opened it with calm precision, revealing a set of documents arranged with exact alignment, every page clean, every tab marked, not the kind of material a waitress would carry, not by accident, not without purpose. And that realization landed quietly but firmly across the table, like a truth no one wanted to say out loud. While William leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing just enough to betray focus. Not fear, not yet, but attention, the kind he only gave when something threatened his expectations, and Naomi slid the top page forward, not toward him, but toward the center of the table, where everyone could see it, a subtle move that shifted the dynamic from confrontation to exposure. And that distinction mattered, because this was no longer about a disagreement between two people. This was about a room full of witnesses, and Naomi knew it. This agreement, she said, her voice even, measured, requires full board awareness before execution. And the words were not dramatic. They were procedural, precise, impossible to dismiss without consequence. And a murmur barely formed at the far end of the table, quickly suppressed but impossible to ignore, because everyone in that room understood what full board awareness meant, and more importantly, who held that authority. And William's expression remained composed, but the delay in his response stretched just long enough to register, just long enough for doubt to slip into the space he had controlled so easily. Minutes ago, you are out of line, he said finally, but the certainty was thinner now, less anchored, because the rules of the room had shifted, quietly but completely, and Naomi did not argue, did not raise her voice. She simply turned the page, revealing a signature block, names printed in clear, formal type, and then she tapped once, lightly, next to a line that carried her own name. Naomi Brooks, positioned not as staff, not as support, but as something else entirely, something that did not belong beneath the table, but at it. And the silence that followed was different now, no longer tense, no longer waiting, but realizing, a slow, undeniable recognition spreading across faces that had moments ago dismissed her without thought. And one investor leaned forward, adjusting his glasses as if clarity might change what he was seeing, but it did not, because the truth does not shift once it is visible. And Naomi closed the folder halfway, not hiding it, just marking the moment, and then she looked directly at William Carter, not with anger, not with triumph, but with something far more unsettling, calm certainty. You did not fire me, she said quietly, her words landing with deliberate weight. You just made a decision in front of the people who will decide what happens next. And in that instant, the balance tipped, not dramatically, not loudly, but completely, because power does not disappear. It transfers. And everyone in the room could feel exactly where it had gone. No one spoke, not because they did not have something to say, but because every word suddenly carried risk, and in a room built on calculated moves and controlled outcomes, uncertainty was the one currency no one wanted to spend. and yet it filled the air now, thick and undeniable, as eyes moved not toward William Carter, but toward Naomi Brooks. Because the center of gravity had shifted, and everyone felt it, the quiet authority that does not demand attention but commands it. And one of the senior investors, a man who had not said a single word all evening, leaned forward slowly, his fingers steepled, his voice calm but edged with curiosity. "Ms. Brooks," he said, deliberately using the name that had just rewritten the room. "Are you indicating that this decision violates board protocol?" And the phrasing was careful, neutral. But the implication was not, because protocol was not a suggestion in rooms like this, it was structure, and structure was power. And Naomi met his gaze without hesitation, without urgency, simply acknowledging the question as if it had always been part of the plan. "I am indicating," she replied, her tone steady, "that a decision of this scale cannot be executed without full disclosure to all voting members." And she paused, just enough to let the words settle, not forcing the meaning, allowing it to unfold on its own, and that restraint made it land harder than any accusation could have, because it was not emotional. It was factual, and facts are difficult to argue when they are placed in front of witnesses. And William exhaled slowly, a controlled breath, the kind that comes from someone recalibrating in real time. Because this was no longer a situation he could dismiss, no longer a narrative he could control with tone and presence alone, and yet he tried, because men like him always do. "This is a private operational matter," he said, his voice measured, aiming to reclaim the structure he had lost, "and it does not concern the board at this stage." But even as he spoke, the certainty did not carry the same weight, because the room had already seen something he could not erase. And Naomi did not interrupt, did not challenge him directly. She simply reached into the folder again and turned another page, revealing a timeline, a sequence of actions, approvals, and signatures that aligned too precisely to be accidental. And she placed her finger lightly on a date, then another, connecting them without needing to explain, because the pattern spoke for itself. And one by one, the investors followed the trail, their expressions shifting, subtle but unmistakable, from passive observation to active calculation. Because this was no longer about a waitress or a moment of arrogance. This was about exposure, about decisions made without visibility, about risk. And risk was the one thing that could dissolve loyalty faster than any insult. And Naomi closed the folder gently, not to hide it, but because she no longer needed it open. The point had already been made. And then she stepped back, just one step, reclaiming space without retreating, and that movement said more than any statement could have. Because she was not asking to be heard. She already had been, and William Carter felt it. Then, not as a dramatic collapse, not as a sudden loss, but as something quieter and far more dangerous. The realization that the room he thought he owned was no longer his to command, that the narrative had slipped beyond his reach, and that the woman he had dismissed as invisible had just become the one person everyone was now listening to. The silence did not break, it deepened, stretching across the polished table like a tension no one could ignore. And for the first time that night, the sound of the city far below seemed louder than the room itself. Distant horns, faint sirens, reminders that the world outside still moved while inside everything had slowed to a single moment of reckoning. And William Carter remained seated, his posture unchanged, but the stillness around him was different now, no longer a sign of control, but of calculation. The kind that comes when a man realizes the rules have shifted without his permission. And across from him Naomi Brooks stood with quiet composure, not asserting dominance, not demanding recognition, simply existing in a way that made it impossible to dismiss her again, and that alone unsettled the room more than any raised voice ever could, because power that does not need to announce itself is the kind that reshapes outcomes. And one investor cleared his throat softly, a small sound but enough to signal what everyone was thinking, that this was no longer a private exchange, this was a matter of consequence. And another voice followed, measured, controlled. "Perhaps we should review the governance implications before proceeding." And the phrasing was careful, diplomatic, but the meaning was clear. The deal was no longer moving forward under William's command, and that shift, subtle but decisive, marked the exact moment control left his hands. Not taken, not forced, simply removed by the weight of what had been revealed, and William's gaze flicked briefly toward the folder, then back to Naomi, as if recalibrating his understanding of her in real time. But there was no version of this moment where he regained what he had already lost, because authority once questioned in a room like this does not return easily. And Naomi did not press further, did not list accusations, did not escalate the situation. She allowed the room to reach its own conclusions, and that restraint carried more influence than confrontation ever could, because now every person at that table felt involved in what came next, not as spectators, but as decision-makers, and one by one their posture shifted, shoulders straightening, attention sharpening, because the conversation had moved from performance to accountability, and William exhaled slowly, his fingers resting lightly against the edge of the table, a small, controlled gesture, but one that revealed something new, not weakness, but awareness, the understanding that this was no longer a moment he could dominate, and for a brief second, the illusion of certainty that had defined him flickered, replaced by something quieter, more human, recognition, and Naomi saw it, not with satisfaction, not with triumph, but with clarity, because this had never been about humiliation, it had always been about truth, and truth does not need volume, it needs space. And now the room had given it exactly that. And as the investors exchanged measured looks and subtle nods, the outcome began to take shape without a single vote being called. Because sometimes the most decisive moments do not sound like decisions at all. They feel like inevitabilities, and in that quiet, undeniable shift, the man who had believed he could remove her from the room realized something far more unsettling. He had never been the one in control of it to begin with. The room did not erupt, it tightened. Like a breath held too long. Like a decision, forming before it was spoken, and in that fragile space between silence and consequence, every person at the table became aware of something they rarely allowed themselves to feel: uncertainty, not the kind that comes from lack of information, but the kind that comes from knowing too much at once, because what Naomi Brooks had revealed was not just a technicality, it was a fracture in trust, and trust was the only currency that kept deals of this size alive, and without it, numbers meant nothing, projections meant nothing. Even William Carter's reputation, built over years of calculated wins, began to feel less like a guarantee and more like a question, and questions spread quickly in rooms like this, not loudly, not chaotically, but with precision, carried in glances, in the slight turn of a head, in the pause before someone chose to speak or remain silent, and one investor leaned back, his expression no longer impressed, no longer entertained, but analytical, as if recalculating risk in real time, while another adjusted the documents in front of him, not to read them, but to create distance from what had already been decided without words, and William saw it. He could not see it, because this was his world, the subtle language of power, the unspoken signals that defined outcomes before contracts were ever signed, and for the first time that night, he was not directing that language, he was reacting to it, and that shift, invisible to anyone outside the room, was everything inside it. And Naomi remained where she was, not advancing, not retreating, allowing the space to do the work, because she understood something William had overlooked, that influence is not always exerted, sometimes it is allowed to unfold, and the more she resisted the urge to control the moment, the more control she seemed to have, and that paradox unsettled him in a way direct opposition never could. Because there was nothing to push against, nothing to dominate. Only the steady presence of someone who had already anticipated every move he could make, and William's hand moved slightly across the table. A small, almost imperceptible adjustment, but it was enough to signal a shift in strategy, the kind that comes when force no longer works and recalibration becomes necessary. "Let us take a step back," he said finally, his voice measured, carefully neutral, an attempt to restore structure without admitting fault. But even that choice carried weight, because stepping back in a room like this was not neutral, it was acknowledgement, and the investors heard it, recognized it, and responded not with words, but with attention, their focus sharpening as the balance of power continued to realign itself. And Naomi inclined her head slightly, not in agreement, not in submission, but in recognition of the shift, because this was never about confrontation, it was about clarity, and clarity had now settled over the room like a lens through which everything looked different, sharper, more defined. And in that clarity, one truth stood out above all others. The decision William thought he had made minutes ago no longer belonged to him, and the outcome he once controlled was now being shaped by the very person he had tried to remove, not through force, not through volume, but through the quiet, undeniable authority of someone who understood exactly when to speak, and exactly when to let silence do the rest. The shift was no longer subtle. It was visible now, not in loud declarations or sudden movements, but in the way every person at the table had unconsciously reoriented themselves, their bodies angled not toward William Carter, but toward Naomi Brooks, as if the room itself had quietly voted on where its attention belonged. And attention, in rooms like this, was the first sign of authority transferring, and William felt it with a clarity that left no room for denial, because he had built his entire career on reading these moments, on sensing the exact second when leverage moved. And now he was on the receiving end of that shift, watching it unfold in real time, without a clear way to reverse it. And that realization did not come with panic, not for a man like him. It came with calculation, a rapid, internal reassessment of position, risk, and outcome. And his eyes moved briefly across the faces around the table, searching not for support, but for alignment, for any indication that the room still followed his lead. But what he found instead was distance. Not hostility, not rejection, but something colder, something more decisive, independence. Because once investors begin thinking for themselves rather than following a lead, control is already gone, and Naomi stood at the center of that shift without stepping forward, without claiming it, her posture unchanged, her expression steady, as if she had expected this exact moment and was simply allowing it to arrive. And that calm presence made everything else feel louder by contrast. The slight tap of a glass being set down, the quiet rustle of paper as one investor adjusted the folder in front of him, the faint hum of the city beyond the glass walls, all of it layering into a scene that no longer belonged to William Carter. And then one of the senior partners spoke, his voice measured, but carrying the kind of weight that did not require volume. "Before we proceed," he said, his gaze directed not at William, but at Naomi, "we need clarity on your position within the board." And the phrasing was careful, respectful, but it signaled something far more significant than a simple question. It was recognition, formal and undeniable. And that recognition landed harder than any confrontation could have, because it was not forced, it was given, and Naomi acknowledged it with a slight nod, not hurried, not eager, simply present. And in that small gesture, she accepted the role the room had already assigned to her, and William's jaw tightened just enough to register the shift, because that question, that redirection of authority, confirmed what he already knew but had not yet fully accepted, that the narrative had moved beyond his control, that the room was no longer waiting for his decision. It was waiting for hers, and that inversion, quiet but absolute, was the kind of reversal no amount of confidence could override. And Naomi took a single breath, steady, composed, before speaking, her voice calm but carrying effortlessly across the table. "My position is not new," she said, each word deliberate. "It has simply not been visible until now." And that statement settled into the room with a clarity that reshaped everything that had come before it, because it reframed the entire night, not as a sudden disruption, but as a revelation, and revelations do not ask permission, they redefine reality. And in that moment, William Carter understood something he had not considered when he first spoke those two simple words, "You are fired." That sometimes the person you believe you are removing from the room is the one who has been quietly deciding its outcome all along. The room did not rush to fill the silence. It respected it now, because what Naomi Brooks had said did not feel like a claim. It felt like a correction, as if reality itself had been slightly misaligned, and she had simply placed it back where it belonged. And that distinction mattered more than anything else in that moment, because no one in that room liked being wrong, especially not about power, and yet the evidence was no longer subtle. It was present, structured, undeniable. And the more it settled, the more each investor began to separate themselves from the assumption they had walked in with, that William Carter controlled the outcome. And that separation was quiet but irreversible, Because once people begin to reassess who holds influence, they do not go back, and William felt that distance growing, not as rejection, but as recalibration, the kind that happens when risk enters a room uninvited, and for the first time that night. His next move was not obvious, not because he lacked intelligence, but because the variables had changed beyond his control, and control had always been his advantage, and without it, the room no longer responded to him the way it had minutes ago, and Naomi did not step into that gap. She did not rush to dominate the silence. She allowed it to stretch, because she understood something deeper than authority. She understood timing, and timing is what separates reaction from impact, and when she finally moved, it was not forward, but slightly to the side, creating space rather than taking it. And that movement shifted the tone again, because it signaled something unexpected. She was not here to take his place. She was here to redefine the structure entirely. And that realization carried weight, because it meant this was not a takeover. It was a correction, and corrections do not ask for permission. They realign everything around them. And one of the investors, a woman who had remained silent until now, leaned forward, her voice composed but firm. "If there has been a lapse in disclosure," she said, choosing each word carefully, "then we need to reassess the entire framework before moving forward." And the phrasing was procedural, but the implication was absolute. The deal was no longer progressing, not tonight, not under the current terms, and that statement, once spoken, did not need reinforcement, because it aligned perfectly with what everyone in the room was already thinking. And William heard it not as opposition, but as confirmation, the moment when uncertainty becomes decision, and decision becomes outcome, and his posture remained composed. But the stillness now carried a different meaning, not control, but containment, the quiet effort of holding together a position that had already begun to shift beneath him. And Naomi watched it unfold without expression, not detached, but deliberate, because this was never about watching him fall, it was about allowing the truth to stand, and truth, once visible, does not need to be defended, it sustains itself, and the room, now fully aligned in its awareness, no longer needed guidance, it had direction, and that direction no longer came from the head of the table. It came from the clarity that had been placed before them. And in that clarity, one thing became unmistakably certain. The moment William Carter chose to remove her was the exact moment he removed himself from the position he thought he held. And now, in the quiet aftermath of that realization, the only question left was not what Naomi would do next, but what the room would decide to do with him. No one rushed to speak after that, because the decision had already been made long before anyone found the words for it. And in rooms like this, words were often the last thing to arrive, not the first, and William Carter sat there, still composed, still upright, but no longer at the center of anything. His presence now just one among many instead of the axis everything revolved around. And that shift, subtle yet absolute, carried more weight than any confrontation ever could, because it was not forced upon him. It was realized by everyone else, and realization is something no authority can reverse once it settles. And across the table Naomi Brooks remained calm, her posture unchanged, her expression steady, not victorious, not satisfied, just certain. Because this moment was never about proving someone wrong, it was about revealing what had been ignored, and now that it had been seen, there was nothing left to argue, and one by one, the investors began to move, not dramatically, not abruptly, but with quiet intention, documents being closed, glasses set down, chairs shifting slightly as conversations began to form in low, measured tones, the kind that did not need volume to carry meaning, and those conversations did not revolve around William anymore. They moved around him, past him, as if he had become a detail rather than the decision-maker, and that was the final shift, the one that no statement could undo, because power is not what you say you have, it is what others choose to recognize, and in that moment, recognition had moved elsewhere, and William understood it fully now, not as a shock, but as a fact, the kind that settles in without asking permission, and for a brief second, his eyes met Naomi's. Again, not with the confidence he had before, not with dismissal, but with something quieter, something closer to acknowledgement, because even he could see what the room had already accepted, that she had never been what he assumed, and that assumption had cost him more than a moment. It had cost him the narrative itself, and Naomi did not hold his gaze for long. She simply inclined her head slightly, not as approval, not as forgiveness, but as closure, because she did not need anything from him, not an apology, not recognition, not validation, and that absence of need was the final confirmation of where the power now rested. And as she turned to leave, not escorted, not removed, but by her own choice, the room did not stop her, did not question her, because no one needed to. Her presence had already done what it came to do, and the door closed softly behind her, leaving the echo of something far louder than any voice in the room. A lesson that no one there would forget, not because it was spoken, but because it was lived in front of them. That power can command attention, but only character can keep it. And on that night, in a room built on influence, the person who said the least had changed everything.